right. Well, thank you so much to Rachel and Megan for a brilliant presentation. Well, we have about 10, 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So please drop any questions you have in the chat. And this is the last chance at Expo today. So if you've been shy before, please get your questions in now for Rachel and Megan. Rachel, our first question of the day, we heard so much about sawfish during your presentation, which are absolutely beautiful species. But a lot of folks were curious. So they're called sawfish, but what is the saw or the rostra really used for? Do they use it as a saw, or how do they eat?
Absolutely. Aha, let me tell you about the saw. So first of all, I want to give a huge shout out to one of the best sawfish saw scientists out there, Barbara Wuringer with the Sarah NGO in Australia. Fabulous. And she is the one who's done a lot of work in showing that the saw actually has a lot of ampullae de Lorenzini. So these ampullae that actually can detect the electric pulses from potential prey. And so what a sawfish does is it goes into a school of fish and it uses its rostrum and saw to slash into that school of fish, whether there is visibility or not, but it can sense it, obviously, with these little ampullae. And then it waits for the pieces to come down onto the benthos and it goes and gobbles everything up.
Wow.
And that is one of the key reasons that it has that kind of a saw, which can be huge, by the way, close to a third of the animal's length in some.
Mm-hmm. Incredible. More advanced than even our fishing technology sometimes. That's amazing. And what are some of the species that they do eat? What are prey for sawfish?
So they'll eat a whole host of different freshwater fishes, some of the freshwater local cichlids, for example, catfish as well. And then out in the marine, if it's a small tooth sawfish, so large tooth tend to be more in estuarine and in riverine areas, small tooth more out to sea. Those will be more like your grunts and your snappers and such. And they will also eat, like a lot of other rays, because they belong to the ray family, crustaceans. They have a bottom facing mouth, and so they're able to actually eat crustaceans as well.
Incredible. And Megan, for you, a quick question from the audience. You had mentioned about chicken fighting and how the rostra is often used in that. Can you tell us a little more about, is this practice legal in Panama? And also, is there anything that MarAlliance is doing to help reduce the rostra being used in this act?
Yeah, so unfortunately it is legal. It's a legal practice and considered a sport in many countries throughout Central and South America and even in other continents as well. This is something that's really tricky. Illegal wildlife trade is really tricky, and I think you've all heard from many other conservationists that this is not just affecting sawfish, it affects multiple species, including multiple species of elasmobranch, sharks, rays, as well as marine turtles. So this is really tricky. We're not 100% sure that this illegal trade, this international trade of sawfish saws is happening. We don't have concrete proof, but just through talking with fishers and just through searches through things like Facebook and internet searches, we can see that there are saws being offered for sale. And fishers will say that they have a buyer that willing to buy saws that they think are going to countries like Ecuador and Peru, which is where these sawfish teeth are used to make spurs. So this is something that's tricky. It's something that we really need to have the government on our side to help address. It's something where government will is really critical. And many sites, when we're talking about illegal trade, it becomes almost dangerous to try to tackle that head on. And as a small organization with limited resources, this is something that we can't tackle on our own. So that's where we really need collaborations with the government, with police forces. So in the Darien, that's the Border Patrol and the Aeronaval, which are the main police forces in that area. So that's something we're building up these collaborations and relying on other organizations is really going to be key.
Thank you, Megan. Very helpful. And another question about the sawfish is actually from Sam Williams, but a few people in the audience, they were surprised to see that sawfish were featured in freshwater environments as well. So Sam was curious, are sawfish, do they grow up in mangrove nurseries at all?
I could take Yeah, so the large sea sawfish is pretty interesting because it's also one of the other common names for it is the freshwater sawfish. So with this species, they are a euryhaline species. So essentially they can tolerate various levels of salinity in water. So they can tolerate living in freshwater and in saltwater environments. So we know about large sea sawfish is that they use these freshwater systems, these large river systems, estuarine waters as nursery sites. That's where the females go, they give birth. And these young will stay in these freshwater systems for several years, eating all the little fish and crustaceans they can find in these mangroves and river systems. And then once they get a little bit larger, they move more towards marine habitats where they're less susceptible to predation from bigger predators. So it's a really interesting feature, characteristic of sawfish. They can kind of tolerate all these different ecosystems.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan.
Just to add to that, one of the best known places where they actually have found large tooth sawfish is the almost entirely freshwater Lake Nicaragua. And that's where some of the earliest registers were actually, or records in Central America were found.
Wow, incredible. And the audience was also curious. We saw some photos of fishers that you guys work with releasing sawfish. Can you tell us more about how that practice is done without harming the fish at all?
So go ahead, because those are the fishers in Panama actually that we got pictures from. So
yeah, so it's tricky. And these are smaller individuals that they've been catching and releasing. So they're not quite as dangerous as the larger individuals that can get up to 4 meters in length. Essentially, grabbing the animal at the base of the saw and the base of the tail is the best way to restrain it. So they're able to hold onto them and untangle them from the net. There is more training that we want to do because especially with larger individuals, it can be just dangerous to try to untangle an animal from a net or a line. So it's something where we want to try to build up more the capabilities of fishers and also their confidence in being able to release sawfish safely without injuring themselves. But yeah, for the ones that released lately, at least recently in the last year or so, they're all juvenile individuals, less than 2 meters in length.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. Very helpful. And I realized I misspoke because I said the fish when I was talking about sawfish, but actually the audience was also a bit confused about that. So a few people had asked, could you say something more about MarAlliance's work with sharks and other species of sharks you work with? But I don't think they realized, Rachel, you could tell us that the sawfish is a species of shark, right?
yeah, so sawfish actually do belong to the cartilaginous species. So those are sharks, rays, skates, and chimeras. So there's about 1,250 species in the world. A lot of people don't realize that we have about 550 species of sharks, about 650 species of rays. And they all have, instead of having a bony body like your bony fish like snappers and groupers, barracuda, they actually have a skeleton made out of cartilage, like the tip of your nose, your ear. And sawfish are indeed fish, but they belong to the rays, the taxa of the rays. And so those, what we tend to call flat sharks in common parlance. And so being cartilaginous fish and species that tend to be very long-lived, some of these species we had talked in previous expos, I talked about the Greenland shark that can be potentially over 500 years old, reaching maturity at 150, whale sharks over 130 years old, great whites over 70 years old, and more. Many of these species are very long-lived and they reach maturity at a very late age. So they have what we call a very vulnerable life history, and they're particularly susceptible to overexploitation or overfisheries. And why are sawfish in particular really critically endangered? I mean, some of these, we've got 5 species in the world and 3 of them are critically endangered to extinction, is because unfortunately, because of their lovely evolutionary feature of the saw, which is such an incredible way of catching your prey, that also is a mega entangler with the worst fishing gear out there, which are nets. And as you saw in some of the pictures, nets are indeed one of the key ways that not only are capturing them, but I have to say that we're also using or working with fishers to use to actually even try and find them and sample them. Thank goodness that they actually are alive most of the time when they are caught. And so, as Megan mentioned, we're working our hardest to work with the fishers to incentivize, to release them. And one of the aspects that Megan mentioned, the wildlife trade, that's hard because one of these rostra can bring thousands and thousands of dollars. It's like the rhino. It's beyond shark finning. It's like, this is like the rhino horn of the chondrichthyans or the shark and ray families. And how do you tell a family that is really on the brink that no, they can't earn lots of money from selling a saw?
Mm-hmm. So Rachel, actually the audience was asking about that. They were curious if, especially you touched on the gill net ban in Belize, some incentives that MarAlliance and your partners try to provide to these fishers so that either they don't hunt sawfish or other shark and ray species, or they can provide for their own family as well.
So I think in terms of alternatives, we do really look at some of our monitoring as being one of the top alternatives, but of course we can't conduct that all the time. But one of the aspects that I found has been very, I guess, very helpful is that a lot of the fishers recognize there are massive declines in fisheries, and they want to see if there's other ways of fishing more sustainably, or can they get some kind of a support to be able to move into agriculture, or can we support maybe their children in educational alternatives or scholarships and such. So we're looking at all of that. We have really focused on the monitoring to date. In terms of the gill net ban, there was a big fund set up, and that's really a huge shout out to a couple of key funders there, and that was Yellow Dog Conservation Foundation and Turnef Flats and Oceana that provided the bulk of the funding for that. But that, in our realm of very limited funding, is constantly a challenge for us to be able to find, I guess, alternatives that will remunerate as much as some of the activities that are so impactful to wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
The work in progress.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, one thing I adore about MarAlliance is that you guys turn fishers into allies for conservation.
Yeah.
Because they're some of the most wise people when it comes to marine.
Well, just to touch on that very quickly, is that we have seen big behavioral changes, and that really comes from building the relationships and the trust and knowing that we will be there for them in the hard times and not just the good times. And that was very much the case during the COVID peak period last year. And that's really thanks a lot to a lot of WCN supporters who really pitched in and helped keep many of these fisher families afloat. Mm-hmm. So that builds up that relationship. And what we've seen in terms of behavioral changes is releasing these animals, and this is not just sawfish, but sharks in general, and then being very proud of that release and putting it out on social media. Mm-hmm. And then we big everybody up as well. So it's, as I said, it's a work in progress, but we're seeing a lot of changes in the fisher communities that we're working with.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, and we got about 2 minutes, so I'll try to squeeze in one or two more questions. One question we got was, so many people in the past month, they've watched this new documentary on Netflix called CSpiricy. And so there was a lot of chatter in this chat stream on that. Can you help us? We know that the scientific accuracy of the film has been questioned by some. Can you guys provide any thoughts on the film? Because I think at the least, it inspired folks at home to really question marine conservation and fishing and the consumption of fish at home. And so could you maybe enlighten them what they can do at home if they do care about protection of sharks and ray species? What actions do they take?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, on that point also, you can visit our website at maralliance.org and see one of the articles that we put out on that has some links to some other really good thought pieces as well. But it kind of gives you an idea of what we're thinking. And in broad brush terms, it's really that the documentary focused on large-scale fishing for the most part. And so as we work with small-scale fishers and fisheries, we felt that entire side had not really been well documented in the documentary. And we felt that all the fishers were being kind of lumped into one: fishing is bad, fishing cannot be sustainable, and really the only recourse is to stop eating fish altogether. Now, I will say the positive aspect is that we do have a a lot of discourse now around fisheries. It kind of what Sharkwater did for sharks several years ago when Rob Stewart was alive, and unfortunately he's deceased now. But this has done a bit the same thing. There's maybe not always accurate, maybe not, head nods to a range of other documentaries that tackled similar aspects, like The Cove, End of the Line, Blackfish, and more. But it has started a discussion, and it has made people think about their consumption, and it has opened people's eyes to the major issue that we have with fishing and using fish as a commodity and treating fish as anything but wildlife. Talking about fish and harvesting fish, no less. You harvest a field, but you don't harvest cows. You don't harvest elephants, or you should not be using agricultural terms to fish. And it's this that helps perpetrate a disconnect, really, between marine wildlife, as I like to call them, and what many people call them, and the realities of the overexploitation. So it's a big disconnect, and that's why we're really trying to push people to think about fish and marine animals in a very different way. And I think it's an eye opener, but there are many complexities to fisheries and fishing that were not really quite addressed there. And yes, sustainable fisheries are possible, and that is something that we are working for all the time in the projects that we're running.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Megan, too. I think if any of you did watch that documentary or are concerned and overwhelmed sometimes about marine conservation, please look to groups like MarAlliance, who can provide some hope and optimism that things are changing, and they're getting better with hard work from groups like you guys. So we are unfortunately out of time for questions today. But we'll reach out to you guys if we missed yours in the chat. I just want to thank Rachel and Megan again, and everybody at MarAlliance, your whole team, for the work that you're doing. And I hope you keep it up this year, okay? Thank you, guys.
We're looking forward to an exciting year and to telling you more about where we get to in the fall.